Google publishes exploit code threatening millions of Chromium users. The old approach just got more expensive. The practical edge now comes from changing process, timing, and tooling together. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Not a security advisory. Not a patch. Actual working code that attackers can now use to compromise Chromium browsers. And that affects Edge users, Chrome users, Opera users, and every Chromium-based system running on millions of devices worldwide. Here's what happened. A zero-day vulnerability was discovered in Chromium's rendering engine. A zero-day means no patch exists yet. Google's security team filed a bug report. Standard process. But then something shifted. Instead of keeping the exploit code private until a fix rolled out, Google published it publicly. The reasoning: coordinated disclosure. The idea being that public transparency forces faster action across the entire ecosystem. But here's the problem nobody anticipated. Publishing exploit code doesn't accelerate patches, it accelerates attacks. Within hours of publication, malicious actors could copy the code, embed it in malware, and deploy it at scale. We're not talking about theoretical risk here. This is a live threat vector. Any user with an outdated browser version becomes an immediate target. Why would Google do this? The answer lies in how zero-day disclosures work. Normally, when a researcher finds a vulnerability, they report it to the vendor under embargo. The vendor gets 90 days to patch. If they don't patch by day 90, the researcher can go public. Google follows this model. But here's the nuance: Google didn't violate the embargo. The timeline suggests the patch was either ready or imminent. So publishing the exploit code was a calculated decision. The bet? That forcing visibility would pressure browser makers downstream to patch faster and more thoroughly. But downstream is where the friction lives. Millions of users don't auto-update their browsers. Corporate networks lock down updates. Mobile devices on older OS versions can't receive patches. Even in India, where browser penetration skews younger and more mobile-first, adoption of security patches lags by weeks or months behind release. A software engineer in Bangalore running an older Chrome version just became a target. A student accessing banking apps on a budget Android phone with a Chromium wrapper? Vulnerable. The second layer of this is competitive. Chromium is Google's browser engine. But it powers Edge, Opera, Brave, and dozens of others. When Google publishes an exploit in Chromium's core, every browser maker who uses that engine faces the same exposure. Microsoft has to patch Edge. Opera has to patch Opera. The fragmentation means attackers don't need to wait for a single vendor to update. They can target the slowest moving browser vendor first, which is often not Google. Here's what changes next. First, expect a cascade of patches. Most major browsers will release updates within 48 to 72 hours. Chrome will move fastest. Edge will follow. Smaller players will lag. Second, watch for enterprise security advisories. Companies that haven't mandated auto-updates will face pressure to do so now. Third, expect incident reports. Security teams will start seeing exploit attempts in their logs this week. If your organization uses Chromium-based browsers and hasn't patched, now is when attackers test the waters. The contrarian angle worth considering: was this actually the right call? Publishing exploit code is aggressive. It's designed to force action through fear. But fear-driven patching often means hastily applied updates that introduce new bugs or compatibility issues. Some security experts argue that keeping the exploit code private until all major vendors had patches deployed would have been safer. The trade-off between transparency and security is real. Google chose transparency and speed. Time will tell if that was the right bet. For most users, the action is simple: update your browser today. Not later. Today. right now. If you're using Chrome, Edge, Opera, Brave, or any Chromium-based browser, go to Settings and check for updates. Force a restart if needed. If you're managing a corporate fleet or a school network, this is your signal to prioritize patches across all machines. The exploit code is public. The attack window is now open. Patching is no longer optional. This is the kind of story that moves fast. Follow at Atlas Signal Desk on X for updates as this unfolds over the next 72 hours. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.